We're continuing with Bible history. We're in 2 Kings. We're in the divided kingdom, and Judah in the south, Israel in the north. And we finished with Elijah. Elijah is largely in 1 Kings and just the opening couple chapters of 2 Kings. And then we pick up with his successor, Elisha. Now, these two non-writing prophets, who are very important, Elijah and Elisha, are in the northern kingdom in Israel. And here we are. Now, somewhere along here, there's a map up, and there, if you start looking at maps of the divided kingdom, you may find they have a hard time settling down, and there's some difference. The question is, where is Simeon? Well, if you want to get into that, you go to Joshua. Joshua is the book that allots the space, the territory to the tribes. Go to Joshua 19. And it says in verse 1, we'll look at the first 9 verses, but verse 1, that Simeon is in the midst of Judah. And that's what drives the cartographers crazy as they try to make their maps. What does that mean? Well, Simeon has certain cities, of course, and they're scattered in. And so some show Judah around Simeon, others show the cities, but you deal with it for yourself and read Joshua 19 and settle up on Simeon. But now we're saying goodbye to Elijah for the moment, and we're on to Elisha. Now, as Elijah did 8 miracles, Elisha does some miracles too, and we're going to number them. So get your marker out and get ready to mark. We're in 2 Kings chapter 2, and I'm looking at verse 14. Then he, that is Elisha, took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him when he went up in the whirlwind and struck the water, saying, and the water parted. That's M1, miracle number 1 of Elisha. And as we go on, we're in chapter 2 and verse 21. They have some bad water, and in this country we're used to pure water, but most of the world, it's water is a problem. You don't even find public drinking fountains in Europe. No, that's an American kind of thing. So there's bad water here. And verse 21, thus says the Lord, I've healed the water. So that's miracle number 2. Then Elijah he had lost his hair. And there's some, it says, I have the ESV here, verse 23, small boys. Take the New American Standard, young lads. These are not little children. They're smart aleck young guys who come out and they're saying, go up, bald head, go. In other words, like Elijah, why don't you take a trip too? And some bears come out and take care of these boys. Now, we're in chapter, and that's miracle number 3. You mark that, miracle number 3, verse 25. He left there, but the bears came out of the woods and took care of those young Turks. Well, anyway, we're to chapter 3. Oh, here we have some kings. Chapter 3, Jehoshaphat, that's J4. He's a king in Judah. And then it says Jehoram, and that's I9, the 9th king in Israel in the northern kingdom. And I'm turning some pages over, and there was a dry spell, and they're without water. And verse 20, there's water all over the place, and that's M4, the fourth miracle from Elisha. Now we're in chapter 4 of 2 Kings, and this widow is without money and without food, and it's this story of borrow empty vessels, and of course she keeps pouring until every one of those crocks or pots is full of oil. This is olive oil, which is not only useful in cooking and other purposes, but it was a medium of exchange also. So she sells the oil, verse 7, and pays her debts. And that oil that just kept coming, that's miracle number 5, verses 1 through 7 in chapter 4. Then there's this wealthy woman, verse 8, who lived, but her husband was old, and she has, verse 14, no son. And she wanted a son. And Elisha said, you're going to have a son. She didn't believe it, but she did. She conceived, verse 17, and that's miracle number 6. But this is the child that died in verse 20. And so a tragedy, the only son, the miracle son, and now he's dead. But we're down to verse 35 or verse 34 and 5. Miracle number 7. He's restored to life. Now we've got miracle number 9 in verse 43. They're lacking food, but food is produced, so they're all eating, the sons of the prophet, and no problem. Now the famous story of the Syrian captain comes in chapter 5. He's a leper. You remember the little girl said, you need to go down into Israel because there's a man of God there who could heal you. And he goes, and Elisha doesn't even bother coming out, but says, go wash in the Jordan 7 times. The Jordan, a turbulent, muddy stream, and Naaman says, they're not abandoned far waters of Damascus, but no, it's the Jordan. And he does, and his flesh is restored. So by this whole thing goes through verse 1 through 14 in chapter 5. And this is miracle number 10, and performed by Elisha. Then Gehazi, Elisha's servant, gets greedy, and you read that story. It's a real lesson about covetousness. And miracle number 27 is not so good. The leprosy that was on Naaman goes to Gehazi, and that's miracle number 11. Then we're in chapter 6. And in chapter 6 here, they're cutting some wood and felling a log, and the axe head flies off the handle and into the water, and they lost it. But this is miracle number 12. The axe head floats, and they pick it up and don't lose it. Then, as we move on in chapter 6, the Syrian forces are surrounded the prophet in the city, and we're to verse 18. And Elisha says to the Lord, smite them with blindness. So the whole army suddenly blind. Chapter 6, verse 18 is miracle number 13. Number 13. And there it is. They're blind. And then miracle 14, their eyes are opened. Verse 20. And Ben-Hadad, the king of Assyria, is besieging the city. And now we're in chapter 7. And the Syrians are coming down, threatening Israel. But the Lord, chapter 7, verse 6, made the Syrians to hear the sound of chariots and horses. There were none, of course, but they heard them. So they packed up and left. And that is miracle number 15 performed by Elisha. We're over in chapter 8, and Elisha is still on the scene, of course, and we're down to verse 16, and it mentions a king, Jehoram, I-9, and Jehoshaphat, J-4, and then we have Joram gone. And verse 25, Ahaziah is on the scene, and Ahaziah is the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, so that's J6. Now we're over to chapter 9, and we're to Jehu, who's quite a fellow, and he is king. Chapter 9, verse 5, we are. And you see Jehu, he's I-10, the 10th king in Israel. And he's mentioned again in verse 13, Jehu is king, I-10. Chapter 9, verse 27, Ahaziah, that's J6, and we're all set there. And we have the end of Jezebel as we come to the end of chapter 9. And chapter 10, Jehu kills all possible contenders for the throne, which was a common practice in the East at that time. And we are moving on. And in chapter 10, Jehu reigns. And so now we're down to chapter 10, verse 35. Jehu dies, and Jehoahaz reigns in his place, who is I-11, the 11th one. Then chapter 11, we're to Athaliah. No king, but now we got a queen. And she is a wicked package of royalty, to be sure. And she reigns in the land. In Judah, verse 1 of chapter 11, and then again in verse 3, Athaliah reigned, J7. Joash is really supposed to be king, and we come to him in verse 21. He's just 7 years old, and he's tucked away so that Athaliah does not kill him. And Jehoash, chapter 11, repairs the temple. And look at, underline in verse 9, he made a chest that the people were to put money in to use to repair the temple. And some churches today, when they're in a building program, have a Joash chest. And big box, and people come and put their offerings in it for the new building. But Joash dies, and chapter 13, Jehoahaz, or Joash, is now reigning in Judah, and Jehoahaz, 13:1, is I-11 in the northern kingdom. And then Jehoash is verse 10, is I-12, and Elisha is dying, starting with verse 14 and verse 20. He died, and they buried him, and then they opened up that grave to put another corpse in it. And when the corpse touched the bones, I'm in verse 21 of chapter 13, the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. Miracle 16 performed after he died with his dead bones. Now, Elijah performed 8 miracles. Elisha asked for a double portion of his spirit. And Elisha performed, here it is, 16 miracles. And now we're to chapter 14, and it says Joash, he's I-12, and Amaziah is J-9. And we're coming down now to the close, Jeroboam the second, verse 23. The first king in Israel was Jeroboam. Here's another Jeroboam, same name. Don't you know people who have the same name? Tom, a lot of Toms, a lot of Harrys, a lot of Jims, so on. Well, Jeroboam, you need to mark verse 23, Jeroboam the second, and he's I-13. And then we're down to chapter 15, and Azariah is J10, and then verse 13, Shalom is I-15. It says Uzziah, he's J10 there. And then we're over to verse 17, Menahem is I-16. Verse 22, Pekahiah is I-17 in Israel. And then Pekah, verse 27, underlined Pekah, is I-18. I hope you're keeping up with me. And we're down to verse 30, Hoshea. And Hoshea is the last king in Israel. And we're going to touch on that in just a moment here, and we'll be through. We're going to have to, our time is running away from us, and so we're going to have to cut this off. But when we come to chapter 16, Ahaz, the son of Joram, king of Judah, is J12. And then let's go 17, chapter 17. Hoshea, who's the last king. And Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, comes down. And verse 6 is very important, 17:6. This is the end of the northern kingdom. It's taken captive into Assyria. You may want to write in the year because this is important. 722 BC. And that's the end of the northern kingdom, Israel. And we'll have to, next time, pick up from this point. We'll finish with Judah and get into the period of the captivity. The northern kingdom already in captivity to Assyria. The southern kingdom, Judah, is going to go into captivity into Babylon. And in the next session, that's where we will be. So finish reading 2 Kings, and then read Daniel and Esther, the books of the captivity, and we'll be all set for our next lesson in Bible history.